One key component of a captivating story is dialogue. People are fascinated by people, especially when they are interacting with others, like through a conversation. There are two major components of dialogue: character and mechanics. Today, I want to talk about mechanics, with why speech tags should be avoided in creative writing. Which speech tag an author should use or how often they should use the word said is something I hear come up in a lot of my writers' organizations and groups. People are always working on trying to figure this out for themselves. So we're going to cover the options you have to tag your dialogue and why some are better than others. If you need help with the format and punctuation with dialogue, I have another video called How to Punctuate Dialogue, Spoken, Written, and Telepathic, which I will have linked at the end of this video. Another component of dialogue is character voice, so if you hang on until the end, I will tell you how you can get a free worksheet that will help you use synonyms to craft your character voice. This is Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and author. Let's start with dialogue tags, said versus its variations. When it comes to dialogue tags, the things that indicate who said what in your dialogue, said is by far the preferred choice. I know as authors we are trained to notice when we are overusing a word, so it's easy to feel like we're doing that with said when it comes to our dialogue. But the thing about the word said is when it comes to reading that word, it registers more like a punctuation mark in a reader's mind than it does an actual word. That means your reader is going to focus more on the dialogue itself and all of the other words around said, not on said. If you use a different type of speech tag, like yelled, mumbled, sneered, whispered, that word does not disappear to the reader's mind in the same way, and they can end up focusing on that instead of what the characters actually said. So this is one reason why said is the preferred dialogue tag. Usually, as authors, we want what the characters are actually saying to stand out, more than the tag we're using to show who is saying what. Here's an example of what that looks like from Birds of Prey by Ian Long in Flight, a 30th Street fiction anthology. It's interesting, Jaylyn, a street friend of hers, had said, always curious about her clairvoyant abilities. So it's like a puzzle? Yes, like a puzzle. All the information is there. The victim, the way they die, and who kills them. I can piece it together. Of course, I don't know what to do with it once I do. What to do with it? Jaylyn asked. Some serious damage is what to do with it. Have you ever visited any of the creeps? Take a look at what the characters are talking about here. Zoe's clairvoyance and how to use it. This is the moment Zoe decides to become a vigilante. That decision has a major impact on her character and the plot. But here, Long wants his readers to focus on the conversation, not a dialogue tag. So he uses said and asked. If he'd had Jaylyn proclaim or shout his lines, that would have taken away from the serious nature of their discussion and its impact on the story. When it comes to speech tags, asked is very similar to said. So if you want to throw in a little bit of variation, consider using said and asked. The other reason I want to encourage you to use said instead of another speech tag is because when you use said, you can't be lazy about what the characters are actually saying. You have to convey the emotion behind those words, the tone of voice, and what they are actually talking about in the dialogue itself. Sometimes authors who are overusing alternatives to said, like shouted or whispered, are doing that because their dialogue isn't strong enough to stand on its own. They haven't chosen their words carefully enough. They're not really effectively conveying the character's emotions because they have to rely on this other speech tag. That is not the most effective way of constructing that dialogue. you should be able to use said and have all of that information present in the conversation. So if you are using the other speech tags as a crutch, you need to improve your dialogue skills. That said, the alternatives to said can still be useful at times. We just want to use them sparingly and intentionally. So here's an example of a different speech tag that's used in Owltown by Evan McCallum in Flight, a 30th Street fiction anthology. "Bill, wake up!" Norville yells. Instinctually, he shoots his left hand out to steady the steering wheel. Okay, here yells works because the character is actually yelling. That speech tag is not just being used to convey excitement or another emotion. The character is physically acting out that speech tag. They're yelling. I would argue that you could use said here, and it could work, or you could use a character action instead. And this would still work. That's because the dialogue is strong enough to exist without the yelled. So if you're thinking about using something other than said to tag your dialogue, make sure the dialogue is strong enough on its own that you don't need to do that. Make sure that new tag that you're using fits the situation, and make sure you're not overusing these alternatives to said. But if you need a fallback, said is the ideal choice, with asked being the second choice. But sometimes you don't have to use a speech tag at all. Next, I want to share alternatives to dialogue tags. If you only have 2 characters present, or only 2 characters are participating in a conversation, you can use the format of dialogue and drop some of your speech tags to show who is saying what. What I mean by this is once you establish which character is saying which lines, you're alternating, because that's how we format dialogue. So you don't need to have a speech tag on every single line to show who's saying what. You can drop a handful of them. This is what that looks like. This example is from Laxmi's Stowaway by Juliana Rue in Flight, a 30th Street fiction anthology. He began loosening Dickie's suit collar and pulled out the lanyard she wore around her neck. Damn it, look at this. She has a Cosmico ID badge. She works for us. Where's that suit I asked you for? Do we need to keep our suits on too? Of course, but only as a precaution. We'll need to adjust her suit pressure gradually to bring her out of the bends. I don't see any pressure suits, Westerbrook said. If you look, those middle 2 lines don't have any speech tags, but it's still clear who is saying what, because of the back and forth nature of the dialogue, and because the third person present is unconscious and unable to speak. This method works best when you have 2 characters with strong, distinct voices. That means they sound like different people with their own unique speech patterns and word choices. In this case, the pilot's speech is more assertive and technical, while Westerbrook's is less certain and less technical. So that's helping differentiate the characters just as much as the format is. When you're doing this, make sure you don't overuse it. So tagging dialogue is all about clarity. When in doubt, I would say use too many speech tags instead of not enough where your reader gets confused, because confusion is one of the big reasons why readers stop reading. That and boredom. The other thing you can do, though, instead of just dropping those speech tags, is to replace them with a character action or movement. This is something like body language or your character gesturing or interacting with their environment. This does a few things that are really great for your story. 1, it helps you not overuse said or any other speech tag. 2, it makes it clear who is saying what, because that character action goes in the same paragraph as what they said. And 3, it gives you an opportunity to include details about the scene, so you don't have floating heads. Floating heads is when you have a large chunk of dialogue without any description, character movement, or setting in there. And this makes it very difficult for your reader to picture what's happening, and eventually your characters just become disembodied voices or heads floating around in space talking at each other. They lose their grounding in the scene. We don't like this. So we avoid this by sprinkling in some lines of character movement, a bit of setting, that sort of a thing. Here's an example of what that looks like from Nowhere to Go But Up by Jessica Love in Flight, a 30th Street fiction anthology. "Good for you, honey," said a woman shuffling into Ashley's row to find her seat. Ashley blinked and turned to face her, confused. "Sorry? I said good for you, for telling that guy off at the gate. Nobody deserves to be treated that way." Warm embarrassment flooded Ashley's cheeks. It took me a long time to figure that out. In this short snippet of dialogue, only the first line is assigned to a character using said. After that, Ashley's movements and emotions function as dialogue tags. Each time Ashley moves and experiences the scene, the reader knows the dialogue in that same paragraph is spoken by her. When Ashley blinks or when her cheeks get flushed, those lines are acting as both speech tags and description. This form of speech tag, this character movement used in place of said, has become the preferred method of tagging dialogue for modern readers and writers. That's because of these benefits I've just covered. It gives you opportunities to have your characters interact with the setting. They could be washing dishes while they have a conversation. They could be walking and looking at the scenery. They could be tidying up the house, doing all sorts of things. And it gives opportunities for body language. We don't always say everything we're thinking, and we don't always tell the truth. Body language adds an extra layer of communication and depth to the conversation. And it's just more interesting to read. It keeps the reader grounded in the scene and prevents floating heads. All of these reasons are why modern readers and writers tend to prefer this method. There's nothing wrong with the others. This is just the way writing has gone recently. I want to leave you with an editor and author's thoughts on dialogue tags. When it comes to designating your dialogue to show which characters are saying what, it's not technically wrong to use a speech tag other than said, like nagged or whined or mumbled. But remember, those words stand out in a different way, and it can lead us to be a little lazy when we are putting together the words in the actual dialogue. So make sure that you're using these alternatives to said sparingly, in the right instances when characters are actually doing that thing, and not as a crutch to avoid strengthening the actual lines of dialogue. More often, you should just use said or a character action like we've talked about. And you will develop your own personal balance when it comes to this. It'll have to do with your own personal preferences and what the scene calls for. I myself tend to use more of the character movement than anything else because I love those added details. But remember, all three of these options for tagging your dialogue are there for clarity. At the end of the day, whichever speech tag you choose, just make sure it is clear who is saying what in the conversations in your books. If it's not clear, I don't care which speech tag version you picked, it's not working. It should be all about the clarity. And because of that, I encourage you to keep all three types of speech tags in your author toolkit. That way you can pull it out and use it when it's appropriate. So what type of speech tag do you prefer in your own writing? Share it in the comments below. And for more videos on dialogue and other aspects of writing, subscribe to Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers. Because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and author. You can find out more about me at www.ignitedinkwriting.com. That is where you will find that free synonym worksheet, which will help you develop your characters' voices, a key component of dialogue. And if you want to see what I mean by I prefer character movement in my own stories, you can find my collection at caitlinburvey.com. My book is When Magic Calls. It's a collection of modern fairy tales, short stories set in today's world. And now it's your turn to use said and character movement to tag the dialogue in your stories to ignite your ink.